So here we go. We'll practice the phenomenological stance in transformative coaching. Who came up with that word? Well, I'll tell you slightly soon. So, as always, I'm Nick Bolton. I'm the founder and CEO of Animas. Many of you will know me. Some of you might not. So that's who I am. This is the 6th in the series of lectures on transformative coaching. And I wanted to start with this picture. This little chap in the middle is me. I don't know how old I am there. I'm guessing I'm about 3, but I'm not very good at 9 ages of people and humans and that sort of thing. But I reckon I'm about 3 or 4. And I wanted to show that because a little bit like my lecture that I did a few weeks ago on systemic coaching, you know, we're all fish swimming in certain water. And there's this little fish swimming in a particular kind of water that was the product of my parents, in particular of my father, who was a very strong-willed and strong-believed person. In fact, his beliefs were what you might call anti-beliefs. He was a very, very strong atheist. And he brought me up as an atheist. Atheism to me was an incredibly natural thing to be. It's hard for me to imagine not being an atheist, not because I've discovered some amazing truth, but because I was brought up an atheist. And the reason why I share that is because throughout my whole life, I at least the first 30 years, maybe 20, 26, 27 years, I spent most of my life in some way trying to validate my dad's belief or anti-belief and my own consequent belief as well. And so what would happen is every time I encountered anyone remotely religious, I would have to engage them in some deep debate in order to prove that what they believe was total nonsense and what I believe was clearly the only rational thing that any human could believe. And how on earth could they believe what they believe and really get into some deep discussions. And I think I was about 28, maybe. I remember I was a financial advisor at the time. And there was a colleague of mine, a guy called Gary, who was a born-again Christian. And he started talking about born-again Christianity, and I did my usual thing. I started going into, if you like, a real deep dive into the Bible. I'd read quite a lot of the Bible because I'd studied philosophy and I was kind of fascinated by, I was also studied the Renaissance. So I was fascinated by medieval religious theology and so on. So I'd kind of read a lot of it and I decided to get into this big debate with him. And he said to me very calmly, because I remember saying like, how do you explain dinosaurs if the world's only 8,000 years old? And he was like, it's a trick played by God. And, you know, he kind of got into it with me at first, but then one day he suddenly said to me, Nick, why do you feel a need to change my belief? How does that matter to you? And I remember thinking, yeah, why? Who am I doing this for? Who am I having this debate for? It's clearly not for him because he's quite happy being a born-again Christian. And it's not really for me because whether he's Christian or not really shouldn't affect me. Maybe I like the intellectual challenge, but it felt like more than that. It felt almost emotional, like I had some compulsion to convince him of his error of his ways. And then I started to think, well, maybe I'm somehow trying to, you know, back up my dad. Somehow I've got to validate my dad's truthfulness in the world. And all of that led me to this position of realizing that I didn't need to go around trying to change people's beliefs. And in fact, what really mattered about any belief was what it meant to that person, not what it meant to me or what my beliefs meant to them. What mattered about a belief was its internal coherence for the believer, not its objective truth. And at some level, though I didn't know it back then, that led me to coaching. I'd studied philosophy and I was fascinated by ideas, but I saw philosophy as a debating mechanism. But somehow, slowly but surely, it moved me towards being fascinated by the idea of the nature of knowledge itself. And who was I to know what was right or wrong? By the way, these are not random strangers. That's my brother and sister, in case you're wondering. And it made me think about like the nature of knowledge. And that's where I sort of began to develop what I would call a level of humility that comes from accepting you really don't know much at all. And it's funny because I had read Plato, and so I did know the kind of the Socratic notion that the only thing you know is that you don't know anything. At least the wise person realizes that. But somehow I still felt like I knew a lot. And it was realizing I didn't. That was I would say, the entry point into coaching, although I didn't know that at that point. But when I look back on it, it was what began to sow the seeds of coaching's fascination for me. So having said all that, to set the scene, let's talk about where does this fit. We've talked about the 5 Animas principles of transformative coaching. And we've taken a look at the humanistic stance, the holistic and systemic, the integrative, the psychological last time, and now we're going to be taking a look at the phenomenological. So that's where we are in terms of our map of the principles. What we're going to cover tonight are what we even mean by phenomenology, a very brief history of phenomenology, the radical assumption that it presupposes and what this means for coaching. And then I want to take a look at some very core phenomenological practices. And then I want to look at some examples of phenomenology in practice, before finally looking at what I sort of have a concern as being as an ethical Trojan horse that is being wheeled in through the gates of Troy into the coaching world, and how that's potentially undermining the centrality of the subjective experience of the human being and of the phenomenological lens. So I want to leave that as a thought at the end rather than something I'm going to dive deeply into. So that's what we're going to be covering. Hopefully that all makes some broad sense. I'm going to start off by what we mean by phenomenology. So I've already talked about the very basic challenge I face as a person, realizing, like, why am I trying to convince people that their beliefs are wrong? Why does that matter to me? And realizing that ultimately the beliefs are valid to that person, not as an objective truth in its own right. So what do we mean by phenomenology is essentially this, that phenomenology is the study of subjective experience. That's the heart of transformative coaching. And in a way, you could say that what I'm going to say over the next 45 minutes or so is really not that new. It's not going to blow your minds, because you'll be saying, well, yeah, that's coaching, but these are the 5 principles of transformative coaching, so I can hardly leave it out. But the truth is that phenomenology is something you'll be very familiar with. And if you're a transformative coach or a humanistic coach, you are essentially a phenomenologist, even if you don't know you are, and even if you can't say it. So phenomenology is really just a way of knowing. It's an epistemology, to use the technical term. And I'll go through a brief history in a second to explore why it's quite a revolutionary way of knowing. But fundamentally, phenomenology is a way of saying, well, that constitutes knowledge. Our subjective experience is valid as a form of knowledge, and therefore the belief of that person that believes in a faith is as valid as a subjective experience as my belief as an atheist. And that was what I really encountered without knowing that I was thinking about phenomenology at the time. That's essentially what I was encountering, was an epistemological realization that all subjective experience is essentially as useful or not useful for the subject as it was for them, not whether it's objectively out there, something that could be proven. And so therefore it values subjective experience as a form of truth. And we'll take a look at what that means as when we talk about form of truth. But you could argue that there's 2 truths in the room, or you could say multiple truths in the sense of the intersubjective notion of truth. But there's 2 truths. There's the human truth, mine as a coach, theirs as a client. And then there's the objective truth that in a sense is, broadly speaking, unreachable. And so what we're looking at here is, what's the form of truth that's usefully explored? And that's the subjective experience. So my definition of phenomenology as a practice is this. Phenomenology in transformative coaching assumes the client's lived experience, somatic, cognitive, and affective, is the central and most important truth we are working with, and that meaningful change only happens when this subjective experience changes. So I'll read that again in a second. So phenomenology is in transformative coaching, and by the way, I would say in humanistic coaching generally, but we're looking at transformative. So phenomenology in transformative coaching assumes, doesn't mean it's true, it assumes the client's lived experience, somatic, the body, cognitive, the mind, affective, the emotions, is the central and most important truth we are working with, and that meaningful change only happens when the subjective experience changes. That's a bold statement in many ways in terms of, and it guides our practice. And as coaches, you will be broadly familiar with that concept. You might not word it in those terms, you might not think of it as phenomenology, but broadly speaking, you'll be familiar with the idea that, well, it's the person in front of me that needs to change, and it's their inner world that needs to change, not the outer truth. Or at least, even if the outer truth changes, they've got to see it's changed, otherwise nothing's changed for them. So let's go through a very brief history of phenomenology, because I think this kind of acts as a nice basis for talking about what it means in practice. So the first thing is you can go right back to good old Plato. And although Plato never wrote anything in his own name, his voice piece was, of course, Socrates. Nonetheless, the notions of Platonic philosophy run deep through a lot of the history of philosophy. So we don't talk about Socratic philosophy, we talk about Platonic philosophy, because in a sense, he was getting his ideas out through the form of dialogue. And fundamentally, Plato was a huge believer in the idea of the rational. And it was the rational and the ultimate truth that we need to reveal and to find. And indeed, for him, almost all forms of goodness were fundamentally driven by the need to find the rational truth of something, the real, what he would call the form of something. So the form of justice, the form of love, the form of courage. These were things that existed outside of the human experience, and they could only be in some polluted way connected with as a human being. You could have a form of justice that was humanized, but justice as a thing was out there, untouchable, unreachable, but fundamentally an idealized form of something. So right from the early state, and by the way, I will say this is a very Western, as you can imagine, a very Western approach to the idea of knowledge. The Eastern traditions have a very different approach. But if we look at Western philosophy, which of course is where coaching fundamentally comes from as a practice, this is the kind of the roots it's contending with. So there you go, there's Plato walking around the agora, talking about forms and talking about the pure reason and so on. And then much later on came Descartes, René Descartes, who of course said, I think, therefore I am, and fundamentally separated the body from the mind. And at one level, drove the whole movement that followed around the Enlightenment to think about the ascendancy of rationality and then the growth of science. So you have this kind of, within the West, you have a 2,000-year tradition of the adulation of rationality and of the notion that something rational exists in and of its own right, separate from the human experience. It could be reached or it could maybe not reached, but you'd have some relationship with it, but it existed in some absolutely definite sense. And of course, even the philosophy of science seeks to find what's true, but recognizes in the scientific method that you can never prove any one thing, you can only falsify something. So even science has this notion of an unreachable truth, because all you can ever do is falsify your best hypothesis. So these first three very much kind of formed the basis for what became the dominant way of thinking about truth, objective truth, and the positivist movement and all that kind of stuff. Then we had this thinker called Edmund Husserl, who was the first phenomenologist, who started a late 19th century thinker, who started to say, well, he fundamentally disagreed with the basic premise that there was a truth that could only be reached, well, could never be reached, and was fundamentally rational. And his contention was that we can reach the truth through the human experience. In fact, it's the human experience that has most truth about it. But in time, this was called transcendental phenomenology, because at some level, Husserl still believed that there was a kind of truth that existed somewhere, but that we were, by going into ourselves, we had the mechanism to reach that single truth. So in other words, phenomenology was an approach to the universal. That was fundamentally challenged by Martin Heidegger, who came along with what became known as existential phenomenology. And Martin Heidegger essentially said, forget the idea of any single truth. All you ever have is located truth, located in time, located in subject, located in context. And Martin Heidegger came up with a concept called das Ein, which essentially means, it's a metaphor, it means the one, and it means the individual experience of something that cannot be replicated in any other sense, but through that one being. In other words, nobody can be Nick Bolton. Nobody can be whoever else is on this call, only you are the one. And so every kind of truth that you make sense of is being experienced through you, and you're not experiencing some kind of transcendental version of truth. You're experiencing utterly your truth. And so from there, You had the likes of Jean-Paul Sartre and Maurice Merleau-Ponty, who took this concept of phenomenology into in many other areas and essentially came up with existential philosophy in its most explicit sense. From there, phenomenology began to move into therapeutic practices because it became a pretty darn obvious concept that, well, I'm dealing with a human being here who's struggling with stuff. They're not struggling with some universal thing, they're struggling with their thing. And so phenomenology became an absolute basic central tenet of therapy. It wasn't always called that. Sometimes it was called the centrality of the subjective experience. It's the same basic thing. What phenomenology can bring, although I don't use it in this way particularly, what it can bring is a set of tools that work around it, what's called phenomenological reductionism. Not something I particularly do, but there is a set of processes that can work around phenomenology that doesn't have to be necessarily about only subjective experience. And the final thing, just to throw in, is that it's now become a very, very accepted part of research with interpretive phenomenological research. Whereas once research was all about discovering the objective quantitative truth of something through surveys or through blah, 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 whatever it might be. Now it's like, well, hold on, you can actually do research on your own lived experience, and that is considered to be a valid form of knowledge, hence why this is an epistemology. Wow, 20 minutes. Time flies, doesn't it? And we'll get to time shortly when it comes to the phenomenology of time. So let's talk about the radical assumption of phenomenology. And it's very simple. The radical assumption is that there is no objective truth that has meaning without a subjective experience of it. In other words, it doesn't deny that there is objective truth. It just denies that it has any meaning if you have no subjective experience of that truth. Like we all, almost without doubt, believe in gravity. You know, very few of us, I suspect none of us, go through the world without experiencing gravity. It has a real objective ring of truth about it. By the way, you might walk down the river tomorrow and see something just floating randomly, and it's like, okay, so gravity is not quite all it's made up to be. But right now, it feels pretty blinking, strong as an objective truth. But it doesn't mean anything unless you're experiencing gravity. The fact that you can walk on solid ground is what really gives it meaning to you. So the next thing we can then say, based on that radical assumption, is that transformative change happens when the subjective truth shifts, not when the actual truth shifts. In other words, it doesn't matter about the actual truth. What matters is how your coachee, in the coaching sense, is experiencing something. It doesn't matter how confused and discombobulated you are, that they can't see it. They can't see it, whatever that thing is. It doesn't matter how certain you are of what they should be doing. They don't believe they should be doing it. The number of times I've had conversations where people say, actually, I think this is going to come, it's going to come up now. The number of times I have people, newer coaches in particular, say, but what if I know the truth? Or more usually, a softer version is, but what if I do know the answer? And I'd say, you don't. They say, but I do. Like, I know how to lose weight. I know how to save money. I know how to build a business. I know, yeah, but that's not the truth. The truth is how they're going to experience it. And that's the bit that I think often newer coaches struggle with, is it doesn't matter what's actually true. It matters how the client is experiencing the truth and if that sits in a useful way with them. Which is why in coaching, we don't reject the notion of suggestion, an idea, treated very carefully, particularly for newer coaches, but done in a way that's completely unattached and dependent on how did they receive it. Like, you might have the best suggestion in the world, which could be as true can be. But if they can't receive it that way, you let it go, because coaching is not teaching. And so, that's all coming from this radical assumption that there is no objective truth that has meaning without a subjective experience of it. Your idea might be objectively true. Doesn't matter if the subject can't experience it that way. So what are the implications for transformative coaching when we start to really embody that and take it on board? And I think that embodying it is so critical. It's one thing to kind of know it, but when you find yourself asking the question, but what if I know the truth? Or what if I know the answer? Then you haven't really embodied it. It's just a theoretical stance for you at that point. So let's say, what are the implications? Well, number one, we coaches don't have the truth, no matter how skilled we are. And by the way, this is a relational thing. If I'm doing business mentoring, people expect my advice. They come to it with a different mindset, and there's a different relationship. Coaching, particularly transformative coaching, is not about us having the answer, as we know. It's about facilitating the journey. So the truth that matters in coaching is the subjective truth, which is the phenomenological experience. In other words, it only becomes true for somebody when they experience it in some real here and now phenomenological way. So our stance becomes one of curiosity and exploration, not of trying to persuade. And we know this, like I'm teaching just suck eggs at the moment, but it is the central stance of transformative coaching. So I can hardly not say it, but this is why we don't give advice. It's not because we don't have advice to give. It's because it don't matter. It's what's the person's experience of something going to be. Now, the good news is subjective truth is not, is not objective truth. And so it's open to change. Like I challenge you to change gravity all day long. And the only way to do that is to go into space where it can't reach you. But subjective truth is not objective truth. And so therefore it's open to change. And that leads us to the last implication, which is our role as a coach is to create room for new subjective experience, for a new phenomenological reality to emerge from the dialogue. So let's talk about some very basic phenomenological practices. And a lot of these will be very familiar to you, some less so. First thing is bracketing. Some of you might have come across that term before. Bracketing was a term that Husserl used, and it's been taken up ever since by phenomenological practitioners all the way through therapy. And bracketing simply means to bracket the assumptions that we, as an agent of change, be that a therapist or coach or whatever we are, to bracket the assumptions that we hold about the world, to bracket the ideas that we have about what's right or wrong, either morally or even operationally, i.e., you should do this if you want to achieve that. We bracket it. We assume that we come with no knowledge. In Eastern philosophy, of course, that's called the beginner's mind. And I've also heard it, there was a really beautiful book called A More Beautiful Question. And they had a term which was vujade. So it's the opposite of deja vu. Act as though you've never seen anything before. Vujade. Such a great little play on words. Act as though, it doesn't matter how many times you've seen it, act as though you don't. Bracket your assumptions, because ultimately your assumptions get in the way of the client's subjective emergence. Next up, one you'll be very familiar with, non-judgment. Once we've bracketed our assumptions and we bracket what is, therefore bracket what we think is right or wrong, we can essentially go into a non-judgmental space, not judging the person. And that comes from one particular space, the humanistic space, which is the belief in the inherent wholeness of somebody. That's one kind of non-judgment, but also not judging their ideas, not judging their assumptions, not judging the expectations, because they might be right to have those expectations. They might be right to have those beliefs. They might be right to have those particular strategies. We don't know until we explore it. And so we enter the space non-judgmentally about them as a human being, but also non-judgmentally about their cognitive, affective, and somatic experience of the world. Next up, we therefore ask questions and reflect on things rather than give advice and offer our wisdom. Good old word, wisdom. This will be very common to you, of course, as a coach, but it's worth recognizing where it's coming from. It's coming from this phenomenological centrality. That's it. That's why we do it. It's not because it's like, well, that's the rules. We do it because we really, really believe that the client needs to experience this through their own phenomenological emergence. And that doesn't mean we can't offer stuff, but we offer it in a way that then has to sit on a bed of wilted, on a bed of wilted phenomenology, slightly dusted with cinnamon. You know, it's got to sit with them, not with us. Next up, we explore the experience they're having, not the objective truth. And often I notice coaches want to go into a truth-finding mode. If I can find enough evidence here, if I can find enough data points, I can reflect back that this thing is wrong and this thing over here is the objective truth. What we want to be doing from a transformative perspective is enhancing and deepening our knowledge and understanding of their experience. You might call it empathy, but I don't think of it as empathy. I think of it as a deep understanding of the experience they're having through a process of questioning and unfolding and reflecting and clarifying and just, am I getting to know this person's experience more fully? And this one's probably not a phrase many of you would come across, eidetic reduction. This was another Husserlian term. An eidetic reduction is simply, it's a tricky one to explain, but it's stripping away the aspects of the experience that don't then change the experience, such that you get to some kind of essence of the experience. So let me explain that. I hope it's okay to share this. I think it's, no, I won't share it, best not. Let me try to give it in a more abstract sense. You're coaching somebody and they share an experience with you, and you might say, if we took away that bit, does the experience still, broadly speaking, feel the same, look the same? Does it make the same kind of sense? Yes, it does. So that bit's not part of the thing we need to worry about, kind of throw it away. And if we take that bit away, does anything change? No, it doesn't. All right, so we throw that bit away. If we take that bit away, does it change? Oh yeah, that changes it. Okay, so let's put that back and figure out what's going on here. One of the examples Husserl gives is the idea of fear of fire. And when if we have a fear of fire, what is the aspect of that if we take away means the fear no longer is there? And if it disappears, we can put it back and go, right, that's the bit that's causing the fundamental phenomenological experience. And then we have the heart of the issue. So we can start to take away things, move it away. Actually, it's funny enough, in neurolinguistic programming, when that was first created by the Grinder and Bandler, one of the things they tried to do, I've forgotten what it's called now. There was a particular term they used, but they would model a subject, they would model a therapist in absolute detail. So if the therapist, one of them was Fritz Perls, had a German accent, they would mimic a German accent. And then Fritz Perls used to smoke a cigar or a pipe, I can't remember which, but he used to smoke a cigarette all the time, that's right. So they would mimic everything about him, and then they would take aspects away. Say, if we take away a cigarette, does that change the impact of the work? No, it doesn't. So the cigarette's not part of it. If we take away the German accent, does that change things? No, it doesn't. Throw away the German accent. What is the bit? What's the difference that makes the difference? And that is a form of eidetic reduction. Very technical. It's not something I do too often. It's something that I find can be useful. If I hear something that feels interesting, I might say, let's take that out. Does anything change? And then really you're focusing on the somatic, cognitive, and affective experience in the here and now, as in what's happening right now. So as you describe this challenge that's somewhere over there, what's happening to you right now? And equally, as you describe your potential solution for it, what's your real experience of that description? Because one of the things I notice in coaching is we often get locked into thinking we found a solution that actually is very theoretical on a surface level. And you kind of know that when the session is over, they're not going to do it. It's like you're playing a game together. In fact, I had a coaching session today where somebody said she had something quite challenging coming up in about a month and a half time. And she said, I could try to relax more and realize blah, 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 blah. And I said, well, let's just sit back and think about the experience you're going to have. Does that feel true for you as you say it? And fundamentally, her answer was no. I'm going to have this experience. I know myself well enough to have that experience. But it's like, great, let's accept that's the experience you're going to have and figure out how you deal with it rather than pretend that you're not going to have it. Now, doesn't mean we couldn't have done something to go like, what if you did this or whatever it might be. But it's like, she knew in her heart, she knew experientially that this was just going to be a tough thing. So let's accept that. That's the reality. Now we can go like, what does that mean in practice rather than playing some game? So I think it's really important. I was supervising somebody just a few days ago and they said something. I said, how true does that feel to you to say that? Like, let's tap into the inside version of that. The words come out, blah, 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 blah. How true does that feel? That's the phenomenological experience of the words. So I think the more we get somebody into the phenomenological experience of the here and now, the more we can stress test it for what's going to happen afterwards. But at the same time, you're not going to spend all coaching sessions just talking about what's happening here. You've also got to make things happen out there in the world. So when it comes to the there and then work, you really want to connect them to the experience of the issue. In other words, don't just talk at a conceptual level. It's like, what did it feel like? Can we put you back in that situation where you felt it? Or if you're imagining doing something next week, let's put you there. Let's get you to the point where you can sense the experience that's going to be like for you. How does it land? What's happening for you as you think about it in a week's time? Okay, so there's some stress there. How do we undo that stress now? How can we preempt that? So the more you can work in terms of the experience of something, not just the meaning making words, the more you're working phenomenologically. So let's talk about phenomenology in practice. And I kind of think of this in two ways. There's the phenomenology of the individual experience, and there's the phenomenology of the human condition. And I feel that in a way they're quite similar in terms of the practice, but I think they offer very different routes for exploration within coaching. And so what I've described a minute ago, the person I was working with who's got to do something quite stressful in May, that's what you might call the phenomenology of the individual experience. It's a very much here and now moment. It's going to pass no matter what. Time is going to pass. That's going to happen. It's going to be over. Things move on. That's just life. So it's an individual experience. But then you've got the human condition, the things that the water we swim in, the very act of being human can be looked at from a phenomenological perspective. So when we think about the individual experience, it's pretty straightforward. How did someone experience that thing? What do they believe about it? What feelings or sensations are evoked now as they think about it? How true does something feel as it's discussed? What is their belief about it now? How true does that really feel when they say it? These are, I mean, by the way, these are not, this is in no way some kind of comprehensive list. This is just the sort of things you might look at. You know, the idea that you just want to get to, I call it the truth, but it's not really the truth. And I think that's really important to recognize. It's what I said at the very, very start. There's two kind of truths in the room. There's the subjective truth and there's the objective truth. But for me, the subjective truth is the only thing that matters, only thing that matters. And so therefore, I want to get to the truth of it. That's why when I say, Animas is the courage to face the truth, it's not the courage to face the truth, it's the courage to face the truth. And that's a different thing. So all of these questions are simply, how do we get to the truth of this for you? And what needs to change here for you? And how likely is that for you? How true can we make this? How do we stop playing the game of coaching and start to tap into the real thing? So this is kind of relatively straightforward in some ways. But what I'm as a coach, and I have been fascinated by it for a much longer time, is the phenomenology of the human condition. Because there are certain things that are inescapable for us. Like this person I was coaching who's got a challenging time in May. Well, guess what? You guys don't have that same thing. You're not going to be going through exactly what she's going through. That's individually, uniquely hers. But the human condition is all of ours all the time. And I'm really fascinated by that. That's what I believe drives the paradigms we operate from. That as a transformative coach, we are really engaged in working with at a deeper level. So the first one would be, let's say, the phenomenology of time. And these are just examples. There's plenty of human condition issues, but we are all temporal beasts. None of us can escape time. You can't go, you know what? I'm so bored of the 21st century. I think tomorrow I'm going to wake up as a Roman emperor. It ain't happening. You might dream it if you're lucky, but even then you probably won't. You probably have some weird dream where you're naked in a cafe. So that's just one of those things. So time is something none of us can escape. We are temporal beings. Heidegger would call it, we are thrown into a situation that is not ours to control. We are thrown into certain givens that are beyond our control. One of them is time. So we are temporal beings. But we all experience time differently. I'm absolutely fascinated by how we experience certain human conditions that are inescapable. So how does someone experience time? That might sound very abstract, but does it feel like it's running out? Does it feel like that, wow, if I don't get stuff done, I'm running out of time? Does it feel like it's dragging on? Oh my God, how do I get through this day? How do I get through this month? How do I get through this year? How do I get through this life? Does it feel limited? Does it feel abundant? None of these are true. None of them are false. They are just simply the subjective experience. I remember years ago, I did a talk, which is still on YouTube, I think, called Time and Timelessness in Coaching. And I started the lecture by playing 3 different clocks. One was ticking really, really slowly. One was ticking really, really fast. And one was kind of ticking medium. And I asked the delegates in the room, which clock most felt resonant to their experience of life. Because it's like a fascinating way to think about how do we experience time. And then what's it doing to our lived life? So once we know what their phenomenological experience of time is, what's it doing to their lived experience of life? You know, are they needing to rush to get stuff done? Or are they procrastinating? Are they procrastinating because they think they've got all the time in the world? Or are they procrastinating because they think time is so limited that they don't know where to put their attention first? Do they feel in control of time? Or do they feel a victim of it? None of these are true. None of them are false. They're just a symptom of the phenomenological experience of time. And then how does their time orientation, by which I mean, are they fundamentally past focused or future focused, present focused? How does that time orientation impact their experience of their life now? How does it impact the experience of their feelings about the future and their plans for the future? How does it impact their feelings about the past? You know, these are hugely individual experiences. It's not for us as coaches to go, you know what, if you were future focused and you saw that life was positive, no, that's not how we do coaching. We're fascinated by the individual's encounter with something. That's phenomenology. There's a great book by Philip Zimbardo who did the Stanford prison experiment, but he I think to redeem himself from that disaster, he decided to investigate time, and he wrote a great book called The Paradox of Time, which was looking at how individuals have a certain time orientation: future positive, future negative, past positive, past negative, present hedonistic, and present something else I've forgotten. And I was fascinated by that book, but as so often with the case with psychologists, there was a kind of tendency to want to label people, whereas I'm interested in just how is it showing up, how are they experiencing it. So then we go to the phenomenology of free will, which is another one I find really, really fascinating. There's been a lot of science research recently that seems to indicate that free will in its pure sense doesn't exist. You know, a lot of the choices we're making are made unconsciously before they become conscious. And my answer to that is, so what? I experience it as free will. Nobody's going to tell me I don't have free will because I experience it as free will. Maybe there's some unconscious part of my brain that's doing the work for me, and it tricks me to think I've got free will. Thank you very much, unconscious. I quite like having free will. So my phenomenological experience of free will is that it exists. For somebody else, it might not be. They might feel, you know, for people in a state of psychosis, often free will is not something they experience. They feel like they're being controlled by outer forces. That's phenomenology. So again, how does somebody experience free will? Doesn't matter what it is scientifically, it matters how we experience it. Do they feel like they have any? Or like a limited amount? Is there a certain locus of control and a certain locus of out of control? Or is it all down to fate? Think about the little things that people say and then wonder, like, what does that mean about their phenomenology of free will? When I hear somebody say, everything happens for a reason, that is a statement of their belief in free will. Now, it might be just a figure of speech, and that's worth investigating, but often it's more than a figure of speech. At some level, they have a belief that everything happens for a reason. Well, okay, so where does free will fit into that? Because it sounds like things are in some way predestined if everything happens for a reason. Maybe not, maybe, but it's interesting how these little things can lead you to go like, oh, interesting. So where's that playing out? If everything happens for a reason, what's the reason for this? That's an interesting question. If somebody's had something that's difficult to contend with, but they believe everything happens for a reason, great, let's look for the reason. That's the phenomenological experience of free will. Let's look for it. Rather than say, no, what are you, like, no, it doesn't matter, it's what the client thinks. So how do they experience free will emotionally? Does it leave them feeling heavy with responsibility? Jean-Paul Sartre's "We are condemned to be free." Or does it feel light with possibility? Had a fascinating conversation with another coach recently, and we were sharing how some coaches feel so liberated by the potential of coaching in the world and what it can mean, and others feel very inhibited by it because they think they have to obey all these kinds of external rules. But that's a choice they're making. And then finally, if they embrace free will as a concept, let's say they have said they believe in it in some way, what is the experience that sometimes means they don't embrace it? You know, like so often people are acting as though they don't have free will, and yet they say they believe they've got it. So what's the phenomenological experience that's meaning they're contracted from embracing that free will? Another one, phenomenology of spirituality. How does somebody experience spirituality? Do they connect to it in some way, or do they reject it? my whole of my life was rejecting it. Now I'm much more open to it. And part of that is because I'm kind of fascinated by what does it mean to somebody else. I no longer try to dissuade people, debate with them. I'm like, what does it mean to them in a very meaningful sense? Not like, what a strange person, what does it mean to them? I'm like, so curious. I never forget, dating somebody who told me that 3 vultures, she was a Nigerian lady, and said 3 vultures landed on a dusty path. This was in the news, a Nigerian paper. 3 vultures landed on a path and they turned into human beings. And because she told me that, I said, what, you believe that? And she said, of course. And instead of going like, it's ridiculous, blah, 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 I was like, fascinating. So I started to get really curious, like what was behind that belief for her that 3 vultures could land and become human. I mean, I find it absolutely amazing to realize that somebody can have that level of belief in something. And then, how is the spiritual dimension that they've talked about being lived out and experienced in their lived life? It's one thing to have it as a concept, but has it been lived out? Is it just an idea, or is it a reality? What difference does that make to them in an everyday life? And then finally, on this little stretch, which I'm realizing is I've got not too long left, is the phenomenology of death, which is another fascinating area, and one that can often bring up a lot of resistance in the coaching world. It's like, death? That doesn't belong to coaching, that belongs to therapy. Interesting. I kind of think that death belongs to all of us. We're all heading there. So it's worthwhile thinking about, what's our experience of mortality? What does it mean to us? What experience have they had of death? I personally haven't had much experience of death at all. Whereas my sister found my great aunt dead in the bathroom when she was 15, I think. She had a friend of hers died in a motorbike crash. My sister has a completely different experience of death to me. So my phenomenological experience of death and my phenomenological relationship to death is very different from hers. So, it's like, what's that experience? What experience have they had of death, and what's that been like for them, and how have they lived with it? Are they fearful of death? The existential concept is we're all fearful of death. I'm really not wholly convinced by that, but that's an existential concept. Is there's this kind of notion of the death, the fear of death kind of instinct. Some people are unaware of it in some ways, like not unaware, but it kind of hovers neutrally throughout their life. And some people are eager for it. I mean, many of you listen to this might say, I did get challenged quite badly on this once, and I tranked quite badly. I was told I was wrong to say it, but it was just what happened. I went through a period of my life where I wasn't in any way suicidal, but I needed to know I had a choice. And I'd been reading the Stoic philosophers, and then I read Dostoevsky, and in particular, a book called The Devils, in which one of the main characters, Kirillov, says, when a man overcomes his fear of death, he becomes a god. And I was like, what would it be like to have the choice of that? So I rang my parents, in particular my dad. At that point, I still had quite a strong relationship of belief with him. Now I don't. I had my own different breakthrough on that, but I had this kind of strong need to get his kind of approval. And I rang him and I said, Dad, if I wanted to kill myself one day, would you be okay with that? And we had a kind of interesting philosophical conversation, but there was almost like a need to have that freedom to say, right, now I'm choosing life rather than now I'm just stuck with it. And I've also always had this feeling like death is going to be a phenomenally peaceful place to be when it finally arrives. So, it's like, what is our experience of the concept of death? And then how does our lived life reflect that? I remember doing coaching years ago with a chap, and we were doing Gestalt chairs, and actually we were doing existential Gestalt chairs, and he put his future dead self in the other chair, and then he was talking to himself as his future dead self, and it was really profound for him, because it was like, if you don't get on with life now, sunshine, you're going to be regretting it. So it's like, how does our concept of death enable us to face life differently now? Okay, final thing before we close off, because it's already 20 past, is this was something that I've been concerned about for a while, and it doesn't really fully fit into the phenomenological theme, but it sort of does, because the phenomenological theme is fundamentally about the subjective experience of the client, right? That's fundamentally what it's about. The client is front and center for us. That's all we care about, supposedly. But what I've noticed has been a growing ethical imperative in coaching. Some of you might feel it, and that's okay. Again, it's phenomenological. It's like, what's your experience of this? But to my mind, as somebody who's been in the coaching profession for nigh on 20 years, I've seen a steady creep in the last 5 years of an ethical imperative for coaches to achieve something on behalf of the world or on behalf of their clients. And I wonder to what extent the ethical imperative that I'm seeing is beginning to decenter the subjective experience of the client that's in front of us. What do I mean by that? Well, what I'm noticing is that there are a growing body of coaches that have some notion of a good life. And by good life, I don't mean the individual good life. I mean the collective good life, the idea of what it's like to be moral as a human being, to be good versus to be a amoral being or an immoral being. And they're almost taking that into the coaching with an assumption that part of their duty, and I've heard these words used, their duty is to create change that's ethically oriented. So there's notions of toxic work culture, and the coach's duty is to help the client see they're part of a toxic work environment. There's notions of patriarchy, and it's the duty of the coach to help the client see that they are perpetuating patriarchy or being repressed by patriarchy. I'm seeing more and more of this ethical imperative, for good or bad. My concern is that there's a growing body of coaches that share a common set of assumptions of objective truth. In other words, this is true, therefore it's our duty to, in some way, proselytize for it. That does concern me. And I might be an old-fashioned coach, and maybe in 5 years I'll be one of those, coaches that are just grumbling in his old rocking chair about the way it used to be. But I do have a concern that coaching is becoming ever more ethically oriented rather than subjectively oriented. And on that note, I'm going to close down this presentation and say thank you very much for listening. We're going to stop the recording and open up for some Q&A.